Hello and welcome back to our day texts. I say welcome back. It's really me that's back, right? Of course, if I'm back, that means you're back and we're back to our day texts. I had to take a couple weeks off or a little break just so that I can make sure I was on top of everything. I have a number of things going on in my life, as you know, professionally and otherwise. So I, at times, have to make sure that I'm giving enough attention and time to everything, not just to the things that we know are most important in terms of giving Jah praise. But it's like we read in the New Testament. If we don't take care of our own, if we don't take care of other things on which people depend, then what good are we really? So, to that end, I try to be balanced, and I encourage you to do the same, not to get overly involved, for example, in things like debates, unless they're necessary. Of course, we want to come together and try to encourage each other. All the more so, right? As the day draws near. But our day is always here. Whether or not we can come together like in these day text videos, or whether or not we're together in spirit. As long as we're doing the right things, living according to how we're made, treating each other the way we want to be treated and giving Jah praise, then we should be joyful. We should be happy. And I hope these day texts further your joy and happiness and give you more information so that you understand our place today and in history, what it is that we should be doing and what it is that the God Jah has historically done. So, before we get into it, which will be a consideration of Genesis chapter 5, verses 28 through 32, both the Greek and Hebrew translations, before we get into it, let me just kind of provide a little bit of a filler summary between our last day text video and today's, because we're going from Genesis chapter 3 into really the last part of Genesis chapter 5. And that's again because I have not translated all of these texts, and we're going according to the translations I've done to date, because I don't want to mix other translations since I'm not able to always explain any potential differences and or the basis for different renderings in comparison to my own. So I don't want to have to get caught up into those kind of discussions. I want to use a consistent text, and then as we go back around and we go from Genesis back to Revelation, maybe consider some other historical related texts, then, hopefully I will have done more in Genesis by then. I'm sure I will, because by the time I'm done with Proverbs, Greek and Hebrew, I'm going to go to Genesis and try to finish it. So once we're done with today's day text, ending Genesis chapter 5, we'll be in here for a little while because I've done Genesis 6, Genesis 7, Genesis 8, Genesis 9, not Genesis 10, but Genesis 11. So after the Ark lands in eastern Anatolia and the families of Noah migrate eastward into Babylonia. And then you have the whole Tower of Babel account, which is consistent historically in terms of dating of those events with our earliest evidence for written language. I've done a video about it. Dates it to between 3500 and 4000 BCE, which is consistent, as you're going to see, with other datings for the origin of language. But of course, we're talking about the post-flood use of language, which in the Bible is described as one after the flood up until a point where it's divided. So we don't know what it was exactly they were using before the flood, but we'll get into that subject in more depth when we consider the account of the Tower of Babel. So the filler summary I want to provide to you between Genesis 3 and 5, our last day text and today, involves, of course, the further response to from Jaho to Adam, Eve, and the serpent, in which he also foretells of a seed that would come and bruise the serpent's head, whereas the serpent would bruise the seed's heel. I'm going to do an entire show on that soon, if not this weekend, then next weekend, in our CW Jah Talk series on the pre-Christian evidence that Jesus is the biblical Messiah. So I'm going to skip past that for now, but look for that show soon. And then after that account, we get to the account involving Adam and Eve's children, Cain and Abel. And by the time Cain and Abel are cultivating the land, herding livestock in order to go through the account involving the sacrifices that Cain and Abel respectively give to Jaho. Obviously, they are not just young boys. They've been trained to herd livestock, to raise vegetation from the field. And this is after the ground has been cursed on account of the sins of Adam and Eve, according to Genesis 3:17. But then, when Cain is confronted with jealousy because his sacrifice isn't as pleasing to Jaho as Abel's, Jaho comes to him and says, sin's going to be waiting for you if you don't get a hold of it. You can do something bad, but you can master it now, and you'll have a blessing. Just like I talked about in our last day text video. And that shows there are times when Jaho will allow things to occur that is within his control ultimately, but that may or may not have a consequence that he desires. Right? He doesn't want Cain to kill Abel, but Cain does it anyway, and Jaho allows it. There are other times when Jaho is determining something will occur, and it doesn't matter what you do, it's going to happen. So in this case, he allowed Cain to choose, and that, instead of sending forth something different, something more beneficial, something that would show a change in heart that would then lead to that condition in Cain imitating Abel and praising Jaho like he did, which would then have been passed on into the human family, we get murder. So at this point, we have things developing based on choices that humans are making that are against what Jaho is trying to get people to do. But he's allowing others to choose because we're made in his image. Then the account goes on and describes how Cain, of course, is afraid that others in the land will kill him because of his punishment. Jaho curses the ground again on account of Cain and what he did to Abel, and says that anyone who does hurt Cain or kill Cain because of what Cain did would be punished. And so whether or not that was something Cain foresaw as developing among those who had been born, I'm sure at that time, because by the time Cain and Abel were at the point in that account where they could be of this age, it suggests they're multiple decades, if not a century or more, old, which wouldn't be that old at that time, as we'll get into. But according to the account, they were able to converse and deal with each other in these ways, and each have these respective vocations, and give sacrifice to Jaho. So obviously Adam and Eve were continuing to have children. They weren't just dormant during those decades or century when Cain and Abel were growing up to be men. And then after Cain and Abel, the account that we're skipping through, but I'm connecting for you so that we have some consistency between the day text readings. It goes on to describe how Adam and Eve continued to have relations and had Seth as a replacement for Abel, according to Eve. And then through Seth, we get Enoch, Methuselah, and Lamech. And it's Lamech that's at the center of our day text today. And it's Lamech who gives birth to the famous Noah. But I want you to remember this about the account involving the children of Adam and Eve, and Cain and Abel and Seth. The period of time in which Cain and Abel and Seth would have grown up was decades, if not a century or more. And so the idea that there's nothing in the accounts that suggests that only Cain and Abel and Seth were the children of Adam and Eve. So they're highlighted as three of the children of Adam and Eve because of the significance associated with the things done by or to them. In the case of Cain and Abel, obviously, the account famously records the introduction of murder and a heightened level of sin and disobedience into the world in opposition to the worship of Jaho correctly, which could have happened. Jaho was waiting. Cain went the other way. So that does not stop what Jaho ultimately intended, right? Because what does Jaho say? We'll get to it in the day text coming up on the flood, but it's because of the increasing violence that he does what? Destroys the earth. So obviously it wasn't increasing in violence according to his will. He was allowing it to occur, and in that sense it's according to his will, right? But he doesn't desire the violence. That's why he brought the flood. He doesn't desire Cain to kill Abel. That's why he told him, hey, stop. You could end this right now and go a different path. but he's allowing these things to occur and then judging them. That's what these accounts show. So, as I mentioned, we go from Cain and Abel to Seth, and then through Seth we get Enoch, and then Enoch gives birth to Methuselah, the oldest person in the biblical accounts at 969 years. Methuselah gives birth to Lamech, who gives birth to Noah. Now, I referenced earlier the biblical history involving the migration of peoples of Noah's families, really, from eastern Anatolia, where Mount Ararat is located, into Babylonia or Sumer. And so we have a lot of history from that area, from the area we refer to often as Mesopotamia, or in the southern part is Sumer. And so we have a lot of records and documents that oftentimes people will bring up and say they contradict or conflict with what the Bible says, for example, on the ages of people. Whereas the Bible will say, for example, as I mentioned, Methuselah lived 969 years. There are records in Sumerian texts that indicate, or seem to indicate, if it's a question of whether or not we have an accurate understanding of some of these texts. But the fact is, even if they're accurate as translated, we'll set that aside for now. We'll accept it as a working hypothesis in comparison to the Bible's description of how long people lived. Then you have kings living for thousands of years, reigning, hundreds of years, thousands of years. And you also have ancient Indian epics that speak of people living a lot longer than what you see in the Bible. Well, before we get to the biblical account then, let's take a look at some information related to the Sumerian text and the credibility of, for example, the king lists that are often referred to as showing periods of time longer than what we read about in the Bible. Let's try to understand what we're dealing with when it comes to the Sumerian kings list, so that as we read these biblical accounts, and then as I summarize the evidence that shows which one is correct, you'll have a hopefully decent understanding of how these texts are viewed, both biblical and Sumerian. And I'll put links in the description below. So, let's take a look first at this article from the Ancient Near East Today, November 2016, Volume 4, Number 11, Sumerian King List, or the History of Kingship in Early Mesopotamia, by Gianni Marchesi. We're not going to read the whole thing. And here's an example of a Sumerian kings list. There's several versions, you could say, from different periods of time, and that really involve more of political use against different groups, as you'll see when we read part of this article. So these are different areas. There's ancient Sumerian city, Kish, Eridu. I'll put a link below, but I want to get to the part here involving this information. I'll go ahead. We'll get to that. That's a different article. Trying to get this one right there. Okay, we'll get to that other one on the Mahabharata in a moment. So here, dealing with the ages and the Sumerian kings list, the reliability of some of these Sumerian records. Not some of them contain information that is accurate, but a lot of them, like many documents today, and the fake news you see out there, information is often political and used politically in order to, put yourself in a better position historically than your opponents. So let's go ahead and take a look at what it says here in this article that I just referenced. And I'll put it below so you can read the whole context, but we're just going to read part of it. It says, on the other hand, he talks about the importance of the Sumerian kings list, and no one is saying it's not important. It doesn't provide us with information that's relevant historically. But we have to look at it in context and what it's really describing and why, before we start saying everything it describes is actual history. And that's why the writers of this article says, the history told by the SKL refers to Sumerian king list, is largely fictional and mythical in character. Though acknowledging this fact, scholars in the past have relied heavily on the list data for reconstructing the dynasties and chronology of 3rd millennium Mesopotamia. The most strenuous defender of the historical value of the information that the SKL provides was its editor, the 20th century Sumeriologist Thorkild Jacobsen. Jacobsen's belief in the general historical veracity or truth of the SKL led him to arbitrarily amend the text or restore broken portions of it with the names of kings known from historical sources, and to suggest unlikely readings for some of the royal names in order to approximate the names of known historical sovereigns. Jacobsen believed that the actual materials from which the SKL was built up, such as the names of kings and lengths of reigns, represents a historical source of high value from which only some exaggerated reigns occurring with the earliest rulers should be segregated. As Jacobsen had done, so did other scholars. But very few of the royal names mentioned in the SKL are actually attested in sources from the early dynastic period. Their names do not even occur in Sumerian and Akkadian texts of the 3rd millennium BCE. These facts alone are telling about the historical reliability of the SKL. Moreover, the reigns attributed to the few kings who do occur in early dynastic sources are either wholly unrealistic or clearly artificial. In fact, there are only 7, including the famous Pabilgames of Uruk, the ancient king and hero of various legendary tales, among which the so-called Epic of Gilgamesh, who is said to have reigned for 126 years. The Sumerian king list has little to offer us in reconstructing the historical chronology of the early dynastic period. Any such reconstruction should be based on early dynastic sources only, but contrasting the text with the reality of competing and warring kings gives us insights into the Mesopotamian tradition and its political aspirations of unity. So in other words, it would often be edited in order to create conditions that different kings viewed as more correct politically. And this could often then lead to these more phantasmic descriptions, if accurate, about 1,000-year reigns in ways that are inconsistent with actual archaeological evidence, right? This is archaeological evidence here, this king's list. This is a Babylonian version of it. But it's a description in an archaeological finding that would then have to be corroborated, right? Because it's describing something before it in terms of the lengths of reigns of prior kings. So then there has to be corroborating evidence if it exists, and certainly not contradicting evidence. And that's the problem. The problem is not the Sumerian king lists. The problem is not what these documents are saying. It's that what they're saying cannot be corroborated historically based on the evidence that actually corroborates other dates. Now, I'll get to that further in a moment, but I wanted to point this out since so many refer to the Sumerian kings list as almost reliable chronology in terms of people that actually ruled. It's not the case at all that that information provided in these kings lists should be relied upon, for example, versus the Bible. The information we're going to read in the Bible and that you could read on your own, I say we're going to in terms of the date text in a moment, but that it provides overall in terms of chronology, even these hundreds of years of lives, 969 from Methuselah, that is consistent with everything we know from history in terms of what we use to date our existence as humans that are described in these texts, doing the things they're doing. Things like metallurgy, astronomy, writing. All the dates we assign to those things are consistent with what we read in the Bible. That doesn't prove that Methuselah, for example, lived 969 years. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that what's described in the Bible for the lengths of lives of people closer to Adam and Eve, who were supposed to keep living. The thing about the tree, the only command that Jaho gave them was to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. They were never told not to eat from the tree of life. And some people read the response by Jaho in that account after they sinned as saying, we got to get them away from the tree, or if they eat it, then we won't be able to kill them. They'll just be eternal like us. That's not what it says. And it's not what it even would imply based on, in terms of what it doesn't say from what it says. And what I mean by that is, so the account describes how Jaho says we have to remove them from the garden so that they do not eat of the tree and keep living like us. Keep living. So they would have had to keep eating from the tree, according to how I read the account and what it says implies, because of the posting of the cherub and the flaming sword at the entrance. So it's not a situation where if they had gotten to the tree, they would have just lived forever and Jah couldn't have killed them. He would have just, if they had eaten from the tree of life, at some point they would have had to have continue eating from that tree of life, according to how I read the account, which I'll get to another time once I fully translate the section. And Jaho's response in every respect in Genesis chapter 3. We'll go back through that material. But it does not say, number one, they were not to eat from the tree of life until after they sinned, because he wouldn't want them to keep eating from it as they're continuing to bring sin into the earth. The tree was to be eaten from so that we could keep living if we continued to do what Jaho said. And that's why in Revelation it describes trees of life there, growing for people to eat from. And so that not we'll live forever if we decide to do something bad, but so that we can keep eating from. If we keep doing the things that show we should keep living. Because we're doing what Jah says. We're doing the right things. We're making the right choice, not the wrong one that makes us worse, not better. So it's important not to rely entirely on Sumerian kings lists or Sumerian listings of kings and the lengths of times that they ruled and say, well, this is more accurate than the Bible because it's older. The texts we have of the Bible aren't dated, for example, to some of the finds we have of the Sumerian texts from the 2nd, 3rd millennium BCE. But that doesn't make a difference. The Bible records events and activities that not only predate what we read in the Sumerian texts, right, before the flood, all the information passed on through Noah and his sons, which eventually became the people that wrote these Sumerian texts. But all of these people, even all the people that migrated down from eastern Anatolia into Mesopotamia and into Egypt, that information was not only continued and contained in different ways and forms according to the cultural situation, but Moses had access to all of it right there in Egypt. And he had access to Jaho, and in our view, to the angel of Jaho, Michael the archangel, who we believe in his pre-human form was Jesus. So we've talked about that before. I did a whole 7-part series on Michael and Jesus as the biblical archangel, the angel of Jaho sent ahead of the Israelites. So it's something you can take a look at on your own. But we're talking about a time when Moses existed in order to be able to write things like Genesis, if he did, or at least bring the people out of Egypt who carried their traditions and the things that he did and taught and brought to them from Jah. That then became these texts that represent which while dated to a later time than the Sumerian documents, are still based on better evidence. We know that because we've not only gone through even the periods of creation and the surrounding areas of Eden when it existed, and the rivers that show the geography described in the Bible is accurate, but everything from the Tower of Babel, the invention of writing, the making of metal tools, Tubal Khan, who's described in the Bible as the one who brought forth copper and other metal tools. All of these are consistent in their dating with the time in the Bible. which goes back to about 4,000 to 5,000 BCE. Seems like to me maybe as far back as 6,000 BCE, but I say that probably between 6 and 8,000 years is how long these events have been going on. And even that's adding a little more time than I can actually show based on the real evidence that establishes things like, again, astronomy, metallurgy, writing. So we have things like these Sumerian kings lists, which are less reliable than the Bible in terms of interpretation, translation, and in terms of their political association and usage, that make them less reliable, as we read here, than things like the Bible, which, while I'm not saying are immune from political bias, nonetheless are accurate when it comes to corroborating evidence, like I mentioned. Things like the invention of writing, which obviously would have had to have been in existence during these 1,000-year reigns of these kings if they were doing the things the Sumerians write them as doing. So it's not consistent. Same with the Indian epics. Now, before I get to that, let me just go. So here's just a brief look at how one Sumeriologist, Peter Piccioni of the University of Charleston, South Carolina, Associate Professor of Near Eastern Studies, is actually an Egyptologist. And he put together this chronology of Mesopotamia. This would likely be the post-flood period of time that he's dating, although it could still involve some elements of the pre-flood world from that location. It's just more difficult to assess as far as what was there at that time, if anything, prior to the flood. But it does appear that places like Egypt and elsewhere in those regions and in surrounding regions were occupied before the flood, and then they migrated back to them. But you notice here he has the invention of writing right there, 3,300 BCE. That's earlier than even I give in my video of 3,500 to 4,000 BCE, or later, I should say. So the writing, so that puts writing, according to this Egyptologist, in his chronology of Mesopotamia, to 5,300 years old. Writing. No example of writing. The invention of writing, 5,300 years ago, according to this Egyptologist in his Mesopotamian chronology. So, and this is pretty consistent with the chronology that you'll find elsewhere and that I've shown. There are places people try to date, like Göbekli Tepe and other places that are just stone with certain carvings. But that's not writing. And the dating they say assigned to those places are not likely accurate either, because of the manner in which they're dating the sediment, surrounding sediment, again, that's piled up and compressed over time around the stone. And so not very reliable. It would have to go through a variety of peer-reviewed studies in order to really determine what they're dating in ways that would make sense. But they dated from anywhere from, I would say, 5,000 BCE to 12,000 BCE. I think it's dated more correctly to between 5,000 and 6,000 BCE, because that seems to be the time during which Noah existed. And it seems to be the place, or one of the places, where animals were collected before the flood. And if built by Noah, then kept there until the time when the ark was ready, and then loaded into it. We'll get to more of that really soon in our next day text, in fact. So keep this in mind. I'll put these links below. I'll put Mr. Piccioni's information below, as well as the article that we read here in part from Ancient Near East Today. I mentioned also ancient Indian epics and how they reference people living longer than even in the Bible. And I found this answer to a question on Quora to be a good summary for us to use. Again, I'm not saying everything in this answer is necessarily 100% accurate in terms of ancient Indian beliefs associated with the Mahabharata, but it seemed fairly consistent with what I do know and found in reviewing this just for the purposes of our day text today, and in discussing the lengths of lives in the Bible, like Methuselah or even Noah. before the flood? Because remember, it's in Genesis 6. It is before the flood that God determines to reduce man's life. But people are already alive at that point, even Noah, by hundreds of years. So that's at the point where he's about to bring it to an end. And then going forward, the ages of humans are dramatically reduced. Not just in biblical texts. In the Sumerian kings list, you also find, these long lengths of kings mixed in with more normal lengths or lives of people or kings. And the same is true for the Mahabharata. So the question is, in the Mahabharata age, what was the average lifespan of a human being? And at what age do men reach the peak of their physical prowess? All right, so let's take a look at this answer here by Santesh Shemeshwar, BE Electronics Communications Engineer, Ramaya Institute of Technology. This is one very intriguing question of all. Okay, and so I'll skip down some of the filler material. So he says, it is said that the average lifespan of persons in the Yuga is different. I'm not going to get into all the different Indian terms and beliefs associated with them, like Yugas. Let's just kind of go through it and focus on the age information. If you want to look up more about the ancient Indian beliefs or even modern Indian beliefs associated with things like the Yugas, you can do that. But focus on what you do understand so we can get to our date text and then wrap all this together. So it said that the average lifespan of persons in a yuga is differed by a quarter of that in the previous yuga. So basically, it is all depending on time. I have read in some books that Lord Rama of Treta Yuga ruled for about 60,000 years after he defeated Ravana, which means he was alive for more than 60,000 years. This was in Treta Yuga. If you look further into Satya Yuga, people used to live more than 1 lakh year. This will give the detailed explanation for the question. Lord Krishna disappeared from this world in 3102. That's not too far from the period of time associated with events described in the Bible after the flood. And it's not too far from the time that the Mayan calendar begins. So we have a lot going on here in around 3100 or the 3rd, 4th century, 3rd, 4th millennium BCE. So Lord Krishna disappeared from this world in 3102 as per the calculations, and this was the start of the Kali Yuga. And according to Adiparva, Yudhishthira was born in 3229 BCE, which is 127 years before the start of Kali Yuga, and hence Yudhishthira was 127 years old when Krishna left this world. Now this gets interesting. Lord Krishna leaves Earth after 36 years of the Mahabharata war, according to Sauptika Parva. Now, and so you say, well, why only 36 years? We're going to talk more about this period of time in the Bible during which it is described as having an excessive level of violence, and the amount of time between when God told Noah he was going to destroy the world for that reason and when he actually did it. And we'll see how consistent that is with some of the periods of time associated with some of these ancient beings being on earth. So it says, Lord Krishna leaves earth after 36 years of the Mahabharata war, according to Sauptika Parva, which means Yudhishthira was 91 years old at the time of the Mahabharata war, and each of the Pandavas are differed by 1 year. So Yudhishthira was 91 years old. Bhima was 90 years old. Arjuna was 98 years old. Nakul and Sahadev were 88 years old at the time of Mahabharata war. Krishna was born 6 months before Arjuna, and hence he was also 89 years old. It makes Lord Krishna, it's not written correct here, but it makes Lord Krishna was 125 years old when he left his physical body. It is said that Bhishma was born in 3278. It makes him 140 years at the time of Mahabharata war. The writer's obviously an Indian, potentially, looks like to me, but writes English pretty well, but some of it is not structure accurate, so I'm just going with it. These lifespans are from the end of the Dwapar Yuga. So in the beginning of the Dwapar Yuga, people used to live more than 800 years. And it went on decreasing, just like the Bible describes. This is the start of Kali Yuga. So people are living up into 100 years now, and it will be decreasing to the end of Kali Yuga. If you see these, so I won't read the rest of it because it's no longer really necessary, but see, you see the consistency here with what the Bible describes, for example, is people like Methuselah and Noah living 700, 900 years. Same with ancient Indian histories. Consistent, at least in these respects. And some ancient Indian epics have periods of time far beyond what is described in the Bible. But again, I say the same thing as I did with the Sumerian king lists. If there's not corroborating archaeology, not just dates assigned to ancient stone structures based on surrounding sediment without significant peer review and analysis, I mean datable things like the invention of metallurgy, the using of metals to form things like tools, instruments, weapons, astronomy, studying the celestial bodies, writing. Those are things that show human activity, that we were actually there. Because those are things that mark all of the characteristics of humans that we have records of. So that's why in the Bible, when it describes people living longer before the flood, but not so much longer and with thousands of years of kings reigning, that it can't be established by corroborating evidence. It describes them as living a lot longer, just like these ancient texts do from Indian epics and from Sumerian texts. But it does so in a way, unlike the Mahabharata and the Sumerian kings lists, that is consistent with other credible corroborating evidence. So, I wanted to establish that going into our date text, because I don't want to get off track once we're done reading and try and explain questions or give answers as to why the Bible describes people living so long. This is how long it is believed people lived before the flood, when people were closer to Adam, when it appears we were bigger, if you use things like our wisdom teeth as evidence of a development, a de-evolution in terms of our size and length of life, just like the Bible says. The Bible doesn't just describe all these people living this long and then for no reason have them living a much shorter time. It specifically says in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, I believe, 2 or 3, that God was not going to keep tolerating what was occurring in the earth. And so he was going to reduce the age or living of humans down. And likely those like Noah and others living at that time of these hundreds of years started to see people die off much younger before them. And so they knew things had changed. And Jaho was communicating directly with individuals like Cain. He communicated directly with Noah. So these are the histories of the events before the flood that reshaped everything. And then it's from there that most people begin to think of the start of civilization after the flood. That's because the whole world was destroyed. And that's why it seems like we appeared suddenly, right there in Mesopotamia. But really, it was in eastern Turkey, and then a migration of Noah's families down eastward into Mesopotamia, Babylonia, eventually in Egypt, and into all parts of the earth. So now let's get to our day text, see what it has to say and how it relates to things like the lengths of people's lives like we've been talking about. And then we'll discuss our upcoming day text, what I have planned for this Sunday or next in terms of our CW Jatok series. But first, let's finish off with our date text. So now with that information in mind, knowing as we do that Sumerian texts speak of lengths of lives of people, kings, far beyond what we see today, and even beyond what we can show has corroborating credible evidence supporting it, but nonetheless still spent that much time and believed that strongly in people living these long of lives, if our translations and interpretations are correct. Same with Indian epics. The Mahabharata speaks of a time when different beings lived on the earth and when there was a war going on. Just like the Bible says, great violence was increasing. And it's right around the time when we have all these events that's consistent with other cultures' beginning of civilization, like the Maya calendar after the flood. We'll talk more about that as we get into the flood. But what I'm talking about here in terms of the consistency in these ancient texts, it shows that the Bible has all that stuff consistent with how the ancients recorded people living and how we lived and with others at that time, and then it changing. But where the Bible is even better, and this is why I have the superiority of the Bible over other historical records series going, is it's consistent with everything else. So let's take that into Genesis chapter 5. We did our summary connecting Genesis 3 to now. We talked about Cain and Abel, talked about Seth, Enoch, Methuselah. Now we get to Lamech. Genesis chapter 5, verse 28, Hebrew translation. When Lamech lived 182 years, then he brought forth a son. Genesis 5:28, Greek translation, Lamech lived 188 years. Then he brought forth a son. A little bit of a difference there. We'll talk about it in just a moment. Verse 29, Hebrew text. Then he began to call his name Noah. This is Lamech calling his son's name Noah. This one will meaning to say this one will comfort us from our works and from the hard labor of our hands, because of the ground which Jaho cursed. Remember, he cursed it twice. Once after Adam and Eve sinned, Genesis 3:17, and again after Cain killed Abel, Genesis 4:11. Greek translation of the text we just read, Lamech called the name of his son Noah, saying, this one will relieve us from our works and from the pains of our hands and from the land which Lord Jaho cursed. Verse 30, Hebrew translation, after he brought forth Noah, Lamech continued to live for 595 years. And he continued to bring forth sons and daughters. Verse 30, Greek translation. After he brought forth Noah, Lamech lived 565 years, and he brought forth more sons and daughters. Verse 31, you notice a difference in the age of Lamech there in verse 30. We'll get to that in a moment. Verse 31, Hebrew translation. So all the days of Lamech came to be 777 years. Then he died. Verse 31, Greek translation. All the days of Lamech became 753 years. So 24-year difference. And he died. Okay, now let's wrap this up. Verse 32. When Noah became a son of 500 years, or when Lamech would have been 682. When Noah was a son of 500 years, or 688, if we go based on the Greek text. There's a 6-year difference in the age of Lamech when you calculate it entirely, and then relative to the age of Noah at 500. So Noah brought forth Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And that means Lamech was alive for around 95 to 100 years, I would say, according to the Hebrew text, and then about 65 years, according to the Greek text. And then you have to consider also the periods of time in between the birth of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, so we don't know that information. But it seems like Lamech would have been alive for potentially up to 100 years, at least, while Noah's sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth were alive. So you see, and of course there could have been even others alive as well from earlier times. The information, the oral traditions, the understandings they all would have come from these people. And who's Lamech? Well, Lamech is the son of Methuselah. Well, who's the father of Methuselah? Enoch. Who did Jah take from the earth? These people had all of this experience and information. These are not people far removed from events in ways at this time where they wouldn't have known what was going on and what had taken place to that point. Okay, so let's read our last text, Greek translation, verse 32. Noah was 500 years old, and he brought forth 3 sons named Sem, Ham, and Japheth, the Greek transliterations. So I wanted to introduce the Day Text show first to get us started again so we can connect the prior texts we did from Genesis 3 with the final part we just did here of Genesis 5, setting us up for Genesis 6. Oh, there's so much information we have there, and in the subsequent chapters that we'll get into when we start our Day Text there on Monday or Tuesday. If I do a CW Jah Talk show this Sunday, then I usually take off Monday. So we'll start our Day Texts again with Genesis 6 Monday or Tuesday, depending on Sunday's show. But at least we've connected the texts from our last one to what we have in front of us. We've considered the information regarding the birth of Noah, son of Lamech, the grandson of Methuselah, and the great-grandson of Enoch. And so I wanted us to have this historical context and not only summarize the text in between Genesis 3 and 5 that I haven't translated, but also help us appreciate the understanding communicated in the Bible about the lengths of lives of people who lived much closer to Adam, who was never supposed to die, but who had to keep living for a long period of time in order to populate the earth in a way that would have allowed it to continue once he died. So it wasn't like Jah could just send Adam and Eve out of the garden and they die in a year. That wouldn't even have been enough time for her to have a child. She could have conceived. So, you see, it wouldn't have made sense. Jaho does things the way he wants them done, so they get done the way he wants. And if that means letting Adam live for a period of time in which he can have relations with Eve and have children so that he can see how they'll interact in ways that he'll let determine ultimately, but he'll try to influence according to his purpose, like Cain and Abel. Or he will bring an end to in ways like he does, as we're going to see with the flood. But not everything rises to that level where he has to step in and bring total destruction. He's giving us opportunities. He's giving us chances to choose the right thing. And if we don't, we can still apologize, confess, get back on the right path. But we can get right on the path that's right now and try to stay on that path. Focus on Jah. Do the best we can. Help everybody close to you, your neighbor. Do what you're called to do. Don't get too excited about things. Don't make it too difficult for yourself. Just read the text, apply what it says, do what's next. Help everybody else. Make sure they're not people who are going to steal your pearls or trample on them. Right? You've got to know who we're dealing with, whether they really need help or whether we're not really helping them or us by helping them. Maybe they just need to do what they already know what to do, or if they don't want to do it, well, what are we supposed to do? Everyone gets to choose. So, I highly recommend you continue to choose to watch our Day Text videos if they at all help you, of course. And I sure hope they do. That's what I'm trying to do, is present information and videos that give you an opportunity to better understand these texts so that you better understand what's next.